So just moving on to our last speaker presentation from Tara Murray from the University of Canterbury School of Forestry. She's a senior lecturer there, and she's going to talk to us about breeding tolerance and durable eucalyptus species. So hand it over to Tara.
Right, hello, kia ora. So the breeding program I'm talking about today is very much the baby, I guess, of Paul Millen and the durable, the New Zealand dryland forest initiatives. And it's really been put in place around two key issues, I guess, that they observed in the Marlborough region, which they wanted to address, which was providing a sustainable alternative crop, basically, for the very dry, erosion-prone Marlborough dryland regions, and also at the same time recognising that there's a need for a more sustainable, ground-durable alternative to things like the CCA-treated posts and poles that were previously, or are being used in the orchards and so forth in the vineyards. So the potential solution to both these issues has been recognised by this group as the naturally durable eucalypts, which we'll talk about now. So the main purpose of the Durable Eucalypt program is very much around selecting for durability. So they're looking for ground durable species that are going to decay much more slowly as timber, so that you have, where's my little pointer thing? You know, you want your timber that basically is not going to decay very quickly in contact with the ground, as opposed to a nasty looking post like this, which you'll get without CCA treatment at present. So that's the key trait that we're looking for in this program, but also the other big one is site species matching. So eucalypts are renowned for requiring the right location to grow well. So we're looking at lots of, there's 11 different species in the program at the moment, and looking at the getting the right tree in the right place, basically. And along with that, of course, we also have recognised that we really need to consider the pest insects in particular, whilst selecting for these other properties. So this is the third component of the breeding program, because basically if you don't have pest management, then you won't get good growing trees. And we do recognise, of course, that eucalypts have a long history of pest problems in New Zealand. As you can see from the graph down the bottom there, you might have seen that one before. That's just the cumulative number of eucalypt pests coming into New Zealand over time, and it's just a nice steady increase. There's always a few kind of sneaking on in. So those pests aren't going away. We're likely to get a few more, but we do need to find ways of managing them. The impacts are not necessarily going to be super bad depending on the species, but we need to recognise that and prepare for it, basically. So we need to thrive in the future, in the presence of those pests, and the pest part of the program has two real objectives. So minimising the pest risks to this new developing industry, looking for resistance and tolerance, which is what I'll talk about now. And the other aspect, which I won't have time to talk about today, is really looking at working out the thresholds for defoliation and what actually matters to the trees, and how much defoliation can we tolerate before pest management is actually required. So that's another component you can talk to me about later if you're interested. So the approach, we're looking for both resistance and tolerance to insect pests in our breeding trials. I'm particularly interested in tolerance. Resistance is a nice idea, but the insects will, they've got wide preferences, so they may well decide to eat something else if it becomes the only thing available. So tolerance, being able to continue growing well in the presence of those pests, is the key thing. So ideally we'll be weeding out the genotypes within the species we're looking at that are not very resistant or tolerant, and keeping in the good ones within the selection of the more durable genotypes. And we'll be screening those breeding trials, making some selections, and then following those through the rotation of those trees as well, to just confirm whether the selections we're making from what we see at a young age actually are reflected in how the trees perform later on in the rotation. The reason that we're reasonably confident that we might be able to find something useful in amongst these breeding trials in terms of pest resistance and tolerance is that there's a well-known wide variety of natural variation within eucalyptus species and even between species and within species, vary greatly in the physical, nutritional and chemical properties of the foliage. Insects that feed on eucalypts generally only feed on eucalypts. They have to be quite specialised to tolerate that type of foliage. We're not so much looking for exactly what it is that confers resistance or tolerance. It's more, are the trees growing well or not, because the chemical composition in these leaves is very complicated, and there's lots of different things to look at. But we do know that herbivores very much show preferences for trees. We don't necessarily know why, but there's definite preferences get shown by the various eucalypt insects, and you can see in the pictures there, this is at the same site, the trees are exactly the same age, same species, and you've got one completely defoliated and another looking quite lush and healthy right next, or just along the road from it. And there's also even evidence of some really cool genetic mutations in some eucalypts where people have seen genetic mutations in a single branch, and that branch will be completely untouched by the herbivores and the rest of the tree completely defoliated. So we want to figure out what those, or select for those species that basically don't get as badly defoliated. We don't know whether the traits are going to be heritable at this stage, but we'll be working through that as we're going through the selection process. So hopefully they are, and we can actually select for them. So we've had a PhD student working on this problem for a little while, and she's gone through and done a number of different studies, and this is one of them where she was looking at breeding population of Eucalyptus bossistuana, which is our top priority species at the moment. It's got very good durability properties. And we basically went through and looked at growth in the presence of insect defoliators, and then compared that, looking at the insect load and the level of defoliation that was occurring on those trees. And it was also important to look at a range of different herbivores, because herbivores feed on eucalypts in different ways. So we've got little leaf rollers here that get into the shoot tips, blister sawflies there that feed on the older leaves, on the surface of the leaves, and then your Paropsis beetles, your leaf beetles that do the whole leaf chewing. So we had a look at all of those different ones. So one of the first things this student did was she went through and she looked at the growth of the trees in this particular site. So she had a look at 15 different families of, 14 families of bossistuana and one of Globoidea, and they're just listed up the vertical axis there. And they're just put in order there, they're just ranked by tree growth. So the trees that were growing better than average, basically above this line, and those that are growing below average are below that halfway line there. And then we took that and we looked at the defoliation by those different insects again. And basically what you can see here is we've still got the families in the same order as they were before for growth performance. And then for each of the different types of insect species, we just ranked them in terms of relative defoliation on those different Eucalyptus bossistuana families. Sorry, it's kind of slightly back to front, but good growth. Sorry, I keep going forward. The below average defoliation is basically on the right, and above average defoliation is on the left of each of those three graphs. So the key thing really to see here is that you've got a suite of families up here with above average growth compared to the other families of the species, and they were generally attacked less by these leaf rollers and leaf miners, so they all fell out in box 2, which is important. And then in box 1 over there for the leaf beetles, we found that those same families were falling out as being the ones that were actually attacked more by the Paropsis beetles. So leaf beetles seem to be responding slightly differently to the other types of insect guilds. The other really interesting thing that we found from looking at these different families of bossistuana was that those ones that were actually growing well, even in the presence of the insect pests, all actually from the same provenance, so the same area of Australia, is where those seeds were collected for those families. It happens to be the most southern of the provenances that we were looking at in that particular trial. So there's definitely some kind of correlation going on there. The other one that's in there, 999, that's actually the one Globoidea family that we included in there as a representative of the monocalypts genus. Monocalypt eucalypts are generally considered more tolerant of insect herbivores, so we had one in there for comparison. Thanks. So the key points there, we've got those 4 southern provenance families were growing better in the presence of pests. You've got them attacked less by the leaf miners and rollers and attacked more by the Propsis leaf beetles. And the really interesting thing there is that they're growing despite the attack by the leaf beetles. So that's a sign of tolerance, which is really what we're looking for. The other thing that was going on when this work was actually started was that the new leaf beetle Propsis turnivaricolis showed up. It wasn't down in the Marlborough area where this research was being done, but it was found up in Hawke's Bay. So we popped up to Hawke's Bay and we've done a number of assessments up there just to have a look at the preferences of this beetle, because it's got the potential to be to rival Propsis for the label of worst eucalypt feeder, I guess. And we looked at the crown damage associated with the presence of this beetle on a bunch of different species in one of our demonstration trials. And I'm not going to show you all the results, they're in the NZPPS publication, but just an example of what they looked like. We looked at the proportion of trees at each of 3 sites, in each of the different species of eucalypts, and we just looked at the proportion that suffered from different levels of damage within the natural population. So from 5% damage up to 60% damage, crown damage was the worst that we saw in that site. The interesting thing to note was that there was massive variation across within each of the species, and there was also a lot of variation between different sites. So I think the site interaction is going to be a really important component of the future work in this area. And what we're really trying to pull out from this kind of assessment is basically we'll go through and look at which of these families within each particular site showed really poor performance, so got a lot of defoliation. We will want to maybe exclude those from future selections, whereas those that did well in a particular site, like this little group here, or these ones down here, those would be the ones that we'd want to keep in, so we'd want to focus on those, assuming they're also showing really good durability properties. So that was looking at a whole range of species in one of the demo trials. We also had another look earlier this year. We went back to one of those sites, Site 3, in the Hawke's Bay, to look at look for family preferences within Bossistoana. So this is, again, we looked at defoliation, this time only in the upper third of the crown, which is the most important for these little critters. And we only assessed the trees in the blocks that were actually doing really well on the site, rather than the low survival in other parts of the site wasn't related to insects. And again, we saw the same kind of thing happening. We had a lot of variation in defoliation. Anywhere from 5 to 90% of the upper crown was defoliated, but it varied both within and between families as well. So this graph is just showing you the mean crown defoliation for each of the families. So there should be 80 dots on there, one for each family of the different eucalypts, of the different genotypes, sorry. And they range from just under 30% to just over 60% mean defoliation for each of those. Defoliation within families was quite large, which is not necessarily a good sign, because that doesn't bode well for heritability, but further investigation really required there. But the interesting thing is that most families we did see, in at least half of the families we looked at, some trees showed very low defoliation. So some trees did seem to avoid defoliation for some reason. So just summing that up really, so we did see a lot of variation, both within, across species and within species. There definitely are individual trees that seem to be doing very well, and those are obviously the ones we're going to be focusing on as in terms of selection for the future. Some of the Bossystoana families are performing as well, if not better, than the Globoidea that we've also looked at, so the monoclip family that we've also looked at. So I think it's important to not dismiss them as being not an option. The Cynthia Mertz is not being an option. Some of them are actually performing, and the idea is to go through and actually select those ones that are doing so. Provenance does seem to be important. It may be more important than family, I'm not sure yet, but we'll be focusing a lot more on the provenance of where the different eucalyptus genotypes are from. And just as a final kind of little observation on that note, EVB, the new leaf beetle that got here in late 2016, was detected in the South Island at the beginning of this year, I think it was, and the first time it was found in our demo trials in Marlborough was in February, and interestingly, there was only a few beetles found, but they were on the families that we predicted as being the ones that would be damaged more by the Propsis. So I don't know if that's just pure luck and it's just making us look good, but we'll definitely be investigating that further to see whether that actually means anything. And just a big thanks to everyone, particularly the growers who've provided their land for all those trees and allowed us access on for all those assessments, all the people that helped out, and of course all the funders as well. Thank you.